Cool. I'm glad I didn't say that next sentence. Hello, everybody. We have missed you terribly since the last time that we spoke. Steve, it's been Lord Steve.
It's been a while. Yeah, it feels like a lot longer than it actually was, though. But yeah.
What have you been doing with yourself?
Well, I wasn't, as people might know, I wasn't feeling too well this weekend, so I've been just resting, getting extra sleep for a change.
Good deal. Good deal. Well, joining us here tonight is a fan favorite. You guys have been requesting her since her last appearance, where we talked about the Cold War and Soviet dissidents. Dr. Misha Griffith is back with us. Hello, Dr. Griffith.
Hi, Kyle. Hi, Steve. Good to see you.
It's good to see you as well. You want to kind of give everybody a rundown real quickly about what we're going to be talking about, and then I will go into what's coming up, and then we'll let you take over.
Sure. What I wanted to talk about tonight was secret police. Basically, in the Soviet system, they had a whole system of secret police, and some were spies and worked in other countries. But what I want to talk about is how the secret police spied on their own people tonight. It's a very creepy story, I think.
Excellent. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing all about it. Guys, if you are a Patreon, first of all, let me say from the bottom of mine, what's left of Steve's and Dave's heart. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We actually started last Friday rolling out before we come live. Sometimes there are more fireworks that happen before the show starts and when the show closes down, especially when we do the flat earth debates, those kind of things. So we've started to put those together, and those are available for the people who are on the Reverend tier and up. I think that's the $10 tier and up, but you can actually go and access the before and after the show footage. So that's one thing that we've started rolling out that kicked off this past Friday, where we uploaded the footage from the Awake Souls and Limitless channel with Red's Rhetoric and Sean Hufford. Very entertaining, so check that out if you haven't already. Also, we will be reading all of the super chats that come through tonight. They'll appear on your screen. I believe it's in the middle. Tonight, but actually, those will be read at some point during the show.
Actually, they don't. Yes, they won't be appearing tonight, but we'll still read them.
Okay, well, oh yes, because we've got all right, another layout now. But we will be reading those. We'll wait till the end of the show when we do get questions from you guys, but we will be reading those. So let's turn now and see what we've got coming up for the week. Starting with tomorrow, Ricky Frack, the ancient coin guy, will be back to talk about his favorite subject, Alexander the Great. If many of you know that have been watching the show, every time he comes on, he at some point alludes to Alexander the Great, and we decided that we would just give him his own show to go as deep into that as he wants to. So he will be with us tomorrow at 8 p.m. Eastern. Wednesday. If you didn't check out our show last week, where we went through the back and forth exchange between myself and a gentleman named John, John does not believe that viruses exist. Steve, do I need to repeat that?
No, I think by now people are going to be tuning in for the fact that they're just amazed by that statement to begin with as a whole, that somebody doesn't believe that viruses don't exist.
Well, Steve, what if I told you that let's do a scenario real quick.
It gets worse?
Yes. I want you to say the following sentence. You cannot get any crazier than somebody that does not believe in viruses.
Well, you can't get any crazier than somebody who doesn't believe in viruses.
Hold my beer.
God damn it.
In at the end of this coming up week, you will understand. So let's go to August the 2nd. That will be on Thursday. Should drugs be decriminalized? We'll have a debate on that, also at 8 p.m. Eastern. And then on Friday, candidate for president in 2020 for the Libertarian Party, Adam Kokesh. He is a fierce defender of freedom and liberty, and we're going to be diving into that on Friday. So join us for that. That's going to also be at 8 p.m. Eastern. And then on the 6th I believe that our guest's handsome husband will be joining us. Isn't that right, Dr. Griffith?
You got it.
He will be taking us through how King James KJV'd the Bible. And that, of course, will be the non-sequitur version, not the KJV version. Thank you. I'll take it. Love it. And then just jumping forward to two things really quickly, the last two things. On the 9th, Bunty King and Vadim Newquist, who is the, how does he word it, Steve? The slave owner of...
he's the human slave of Creationist Cat.
Right.
Yeah.
I'll let you guys unpack that, but they will both be joining us on Wednesday to talk about free speech. Now, remember when I told you to hold my beer for people who don't think viruses exist? What if I told you that there was a group of people that think a long time ago there was a group that buried fossils in order to deceive man for when we would find them? They planted fossils. What if I told you dinosaurs were a hoax, Steve?
Yeah, I think that might be marginally worse.
Well, get ready. On August,
They don't exist. There's no such group. Bullshit.
Christians Against Dinosaurs.
No.
August the 14th. It's settled. It's happening. And I'm not I can't tell you if I'm like terrified, excited, overwhelmed, anxious, all of those things. But August the 14th, that's D-Day, Dinosaur Day.
I have no words. I'm speechless. And that for me is saying something.
That is for you definitely saying something. So, well, actually, you better get some words because I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about Producer Dave, and then we will jump right into tonight's conversation.
I do have some words, but on that whole not believing in viruses, I think Sweet Heathen said it best a while ago. She said, viruses don't exist. It's just a theory of sick. I thought that was pretty brilliant.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Playing on the theory of down, right?
Yeah, so just a theory of sick, screw theory, no viruses. It's just a theory of sick.
Well done.
That was brilliant, actually. But anyways, so if people might have looked in the video description, they might have seen a special GoFundMe that was set up for Dave Fulton here. Dave Boltonator is our producer, as you guys may know. Unfortunately, Dave has had some problems with work-relating things. He lost his job. And we are still trying to keep him to do this full time. Obviously, we're trying to help him out financially and get him back on his feet, so he at least have a place to live until he finds where some new job for his area. So we have set up a GoFundMe. It's separate from the Patreon and everything else. But if you want to go donate to him for just a couple bucks, everything else helps out. The description has the GoFundMe for that and a little more details on that. But everything that we can do to help Dave out, we'll definitely do.
Absolutely. All right. And now it is my pleasure to hand the reins of the show. Careful, Dr. Griffith. You have a lot of power in your hands now.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm always surprised when we get the PhD still agreeing to come on. After
yeah, more than once, right? I mean,
after some
first
of the
time
things,
it's like, you know what, they just don't know better. But the second, third time, yeah, weird.
Don't sell yourself short, you guys. This is a fun show to be on, and I recommend it to any PhD who wants to get
your husband's a lucky
exposure.
Man. We love you.
You are the best.
Sweet.
You'll wait until next week.
She's actually a member of Christians Against Dinosaurs. Did she not tell you that?
Oh.
No, I'm kidding.
Oh. This changes things.
No, I'm a historian.
Those are the ones you don't expect, right?
We don't have simple answers like that.
Oh, so, that's funny.
What I wanted to talk about, delving back into the Cold War. In America, we don't have a national police force, right? We have the military. They have their purview as per, the Constitution and all those rules. We have the CIA, which was created after World War II, but they're all foreign intelligence. We also have several other intelligence agencies that basically don't necessarily work domestically. What we have domestically is, of course, the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. But if you think about their title, the Bureau of Investigation, they're not overseeing people. They're investigating crimes. And that's basically what we do. We have a couple of other groups like the Secret Service, who are part of the Department of Treasury. They look for, what's the term I'm looking for? Counterfeit money. Yeah, counterfeit money and that sort of thing. But we don't have a police force that works for the entire country. We're kind of a system that came out of medieval England with sheriffs and counties and jury trials that are local. Henry I and Henry II and the Magna Carta after that and all that. That's our tradition in the United States. But going to places like the Soviet Union, they had a tradition of not just police, national police, that were separate from our from the military, but actually were secret police. Now, there have been secret police as long as there have been empires. I think Digital Hammurabi, Josh can tell you about the secret police that the Neo-Assyrians had. The Persians under Cyrus and Darius had secret police. That was one of the things that kept their empire going. But really, we see the concept of secret police coming out of the 19th century when we get nations. Some of the more famous secret police were, of course, the Austro-Hungarian Empire secret police. They were particularly nasty. And in Russia, the secret police pop up around 1880. So there was a group of secret policemen in Russia known as the Okhrana, who were working directly for the Tsar and doing the Tsar's bidding throughout Russia. And they had internal exile, they had prisons, they had spies infiltrating domestically. So that tradition is pretty old in Europe and in Russia. But with the coming of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, Lenin really wanted a way to enforce the ideology. There was a paranoia of both espionage from the outside, but also people not agreeing on the inside. And so the secret police that developed at that time, they were called Cheka. Dave, if we can have the second slide, please.
Done, sorry.
Oh, okay, that's okay. So the Cheka was the earliest of the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs. And then we will go through a series of different types of secret police. They're all organized a little bit differently. The names we see most often is the KGB, and I'm going to use that term from now on, but just remember, I'm talking about all of the secret police. They were generally under the Ministry of the Interior. Under Stalin, they worked directly for Stalin. He was completely in charge of these guys. And their whole idea was to defend the ideology. In America, we have our rights. We have these immutable rights guaranteed to us by the Constitution. And, fingers crossed, we can keep them going. But laws change. They're not immutable. That's why we still have state legislators or federal legislators or Congress. We have those because the laws change. Our ideas about laws change. This is a kind of a self-correcting sort of system. In the Soviet Union, the laws were laid down not by the state. The party was in charge. It was the party ideology. If you remember Yakov Smirnov and all of his jokes about party finds you, there is a kernel of truth in that it was the party ideology that was far more important in the Soviet Union than the state mechanism was.
Usually, I don't remember too much when it comes to Smirnoff.
Yeah, no, he had a whole very brief career, and then the Berlin Wall fell, and that was it. But he had a nifty little career. About the same time as Robin Williams' film Moscow on the Hudson came out.
Yeah, I definitely remember Yakov Smirnoff, and the Smirnoff that Kyle's referring to. I know very well.
The
course,
vodka, the vodka kind.
Yeah.
And the Wendy's commercials is next. Spin there, and the lady with the flashlight and the anyway. Look up Wendy's fashion show, communist fashion show. It's a great series of commercials.
That just sounds funny. Wendy's communist fashion show.
Mm-hmm. Yep, definitely worth watching.
Got it.
So you saw that list of all of the different changes that the KGB went through during the time of the Soviet Union. Usually those changes came about because Stalin or whoever was in charge had the guy who was in charge of the KGB executed. These guys did not last long. They ran afoul of Stalin, and Stalin had frequent purges to get rid of the guys that he was afraid would try to take over for him. This was true basically in 1936. If Dave, if I could have slide number 10.
So these guys took these positions knowing that it wouldn't be long before they were relieved of duty, so to speak.
I think they had a hope that eventually Stalin would die, or that, so that you've got, is that the one of Beria and Stalin? Excellent. Okay. So in the 1930s, using the KGB, Stalin and his later head of the KGB, Beria, created a system of the Great Purge, is what it's called. It started in 1934. It officially went until 1939. But Stalin envisioned using the assassination of one of the higher ups in the Communist Party to get rid of a whole bunch of his competition, all the old Bolsheviks that had been around since the Bolshevik Revolution. And so Stalin started coming up with lists of people to exterminate, basically. Dave, if we can go on to the next slide, slide number 11. And this is one of his lists of people to kill. Just a nice long list of names. Go out, find them, and shoot them. That big blue writing on it is Stalin's signature. Stalin used to be a newspaper editor, and so he didn't write with pencils or anything. He wrote with big red and blue crayons, like a newspaper editor would. So you see his marks all over papers, notes, and everything. If
spooky.
They didn't, oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
That's spooky. It reminds me of Richard Nixon's list.
Enemies list, exactly what it was, except these people were actually rounded up and shot.
Yeah, big difference there.
Yeah, big difference. Many of them were put on trial. These were the show trials that happened for this time, 34 to 39. And there were some later as well, but the main ones happened at this time. And the whole idea was to get the people to see the KGB in action in a way that kind of glossed over the rough parts, in that they would round up hundreds of people, take them into the prison at Lubyanka. Actually, if I can see slide number 12. Thank you. They would be picked up in these trucks called the Black Marias or Black Ravens. And these were disguised as delivery trucks, but they had cells inside of them that you couldn't move in. You were stuck inside of these things. And then they would go around and collect people and then take them to Lubyanka prison, which is in the heart of Moscow. If I can have the next slide, please. Okay. Lubyanka prison was, the basement was full of these cells that they kept people in. And the KGB was not interested in actually looking for crimes, looking at who was guilty. That would have been a waste of time. More effective was just torturing these people until they confessed. That way, you had this idea in Marxist thought that self-criticism was important. You could get these people, if you beat them hard enough and long enough and deprived them, and after you got done beating them, if they still were not willing to confess, you said, the KGB would say, we're going to do this to your wife, we're going to do this to your family, we're going to do this to your children. Do you want that to happen? Generally speaking, I'm sorry, Kyle?
What were they trying to get them to confess specifically?
Anything, any crime.
Just anything
Usually
against the state, crimes against the state.
Crimes against the state, mainly. Yeah. Sabotage, wreckers, as they called them, or going against the party, or having counter-revolutionary ideas. And so they were extraordinarily nasty. Now, this was unlike a process we can even imagine. People were rounded up in the middle of the nights, thrown in the backs of these trucks, taken to this prison. They were held completely incommunicado. Oftentimes they were not fed. They never saw daylight. They were beaten daily and asked questions. Who do you know? Who else is committing this crime? They promised them lighter sentences if they told on people, if they exposed friends or whatever. So this went on and on for several years. And these show crimes, these show trials, once they got a group of people willing to confess, and usually these were very high up people, once they were willing to confess, they made them memorize a script. We have the scripts. And then there was a show trial. It was open to parts of the public, and they broadcast them on the radio. And the people who were to confess the crimes, they usually confessed, even to the point of saying, I deserve to be shot for the crimes I committed. Never mind that they never committed any crimes.
Wow.
They would come out and say, I deserve to be shot like a dog. And they take them out back and shoot them.
I wonder if that's a way of getting it over. You know, they'd been tortured to such an extent that they would rather be shot than go through another second of that.
Sure. There was one case in which one gentleman had agreed to confess. He got in the courtroom and changed his mind and told the judge he was not guilty. And they ended the court proceedings for the day. The next day, he was back in court with dislocated shoulders and said, yeah, I did do the crime.
Damn.
So, yeah. Ouch.
It was a different world back then. Like
it was a very different world. If I can have the slide number 14, please, Dave.
And all of this is gearing up. Like this is right before World War II.
This is right before World War II. Stalin will purge his officer corps. Something like 5 of his top 7 generals and at least 3,000 officers from the Red Army will be executed in this way. The numbers we're talking about are unimaginable. Some historians put that number at close to 10 million people were killed.
Was this more of a paranoia thing, or was this a way of just him having a iron rule, showing people that he's
iron rule? Yes. Paranoia? Yes. Trying to keep people in line. And They had quotas. Just as manufacturing had quotas, they had quotas. We have lists of a location. You are to arrest this many people. You are to shoot this many people. And we have in Stalin's crayons crossed out the number and doubled it.
I have so many questions, like just real briefly.
Sure.
10 million is a number that is substantially larger than what actually happened in the Holocaust. Why is this not as prevalent in terms of atrocities committed than that is? You know what I'm saying? Like to round up 10 million people just for the reason that somebody wanted to, you know, stay in power or scare tactics. How is this not a bigger deal than it is?
It's a huge deal. Those of us who study Soviet and Russian history, we're really tuned into this. This is not really the worst thing Stalin did. After the Civil War started in 1918, went to about 22, 23. Stalin manufactured a famine. He wanted to get rid of the private ownership of the farms and collectivize the farms. He had what was the KGB at the time round up the food from the people growing it and just ship it to the cities, leaving no food in the countryside. And they figure close to 20 million people starved to death.
I am actually saddened that hell doesn't actually exist.
Yeah.
Because he is a prime candidate for that.
Yeah, and I like to use a little bit more conservative numbers for this. There are people who come out with numbers like 60 million. I don't think it was quite that bad, but I mean, it's bad enough. Oh, I wanted to go back to a couple little things, a couple little of the tendencies that happened inside the Soviet Union at this point. All right, Dave, if we're back on slide number 14. I'm using some artwork from people who were actually there, who were witnesses. Much of this artwork, you can find it on the website Gulag, Many Days, Many Lives. This was put together by the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media at George Mason University. It's an excellent website, Gulag, Many Days, Many Lives, and it will give you some very good insight along with a lot of primary sources. One of the more interesting techniques of the KGB was something called 10 years hard labor without the right of correspondence. Okay, 10 years you aren't able to correspond with your family, with your friends, with anyone. And what that really was a euphemism for was that person was shot, oftentimes without a trial, but shot in the prison. And their family was told, no, they're at hard labor for 10 years without the right of correspondence. And when the family would show up 10 years later and say, hey, we're here to pick up our father, our brother, whatever, say, well, you know, he'd been shot years ago, just dumped unceremoniously into a pit.
Crazy.
Yeah. What goes beyond just executing people was the Gulag system. And this is a system that they were labor camps. Stalin saw them as camps not to kill people, but camps to re-educate and camps to get slave labor out of. He had lots of building projects like the White Canal, like mining, like laying roads in Siberia. And so he used this Gulag system to get enough prisoners. If we could have slide number 15. That's one of the barracks. That's one of the barracks in the Gulag system. This is, I think you can look at and say, wait a minute, that looks like Buchenwald. The Gulag camps, and there were thousands of them, were not death camps. There weren't crematoria, there weren't gas chambers. They basically just worked and starved people to death. If we can have the next slide, slide number 16.
In a sense, that's worse.
Yeah.
You know, that slow torture of.
They were given meager food rations. The where they were was real inhospitable, usually really hot or very, very cold in the winter. You can see in this slide, you can see the guy going out to get water from a well. And they had really, really poor clothing, and they had quotas in order to get food that they could not possibly meet. The people who were there said, there's no way we could chop enough wood to meet our quota. They would cheat often and do all sorts of things. And it wasn't just political prisoners. It was political prisoners and regular criminals thrown together. So they were people who had just been picked up off of the street, accused of a crime, thrown into the gulag system, and they're sharing bunks with murderers and pedophiles.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but
no, go ahead.
Did the other countries such as the United States know that this was going on at the time? Like, were we aware that this situation was happening?
We probably heard some inkling of it, but we really didn't know anything until Alexander Solzhenitsyn published his book, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which is a fictional tale, but an autobiographical sketch of what being in the Gulag was like. I assign it to my students. It's a short book, but it's a very interesting look at what was going through these people's minds.
Not to diverge from it, but
sure.
We have like in North Korea, they have these types of things still today, do they not?
Yes.
So we are aware of other countries, and yet, you know, we don't seem to do a lot. So even if we had knowledge of the Gulag back then, do you think that we would have really done much about it? Because they exist now, we're not doing anything.
Why?
Yeah. You know? We wouldn't do anything. Even today, there's a lot of denial in Russia that a lot of this went on. There are certain museums like the Perm 36 Museum. In fact, if we could go to slide number 17, this was a prison within the Gulag prison. If you had broken any rules or the guards just were mad at you, they threw you inside solitary confinement in these prisons. The left-hand picture is looking through the peephole, looking into the cell of this room. There's no glass on the windows. That's just bars. So they were open to the atmosphere. There's no heat in that room. And the prisoners had to deal with, how do you sleep without blankets in a room where it's below freezing and you've got no blankets? It was torture. The picture on the right was, that's their toilet. That thing that looks like a garbage can lid, that's the toilet for this room.
Outrageous.
Yeah, and I don't think they had running water. I think that sink, you just had to bring your own water in. So that's the Soviet system, and it went on for a very long time. Khrushchev tried to end that system after 1956 because, of course, Khrushchev is trying to distance himself from Stalin. It didn't entirely go away. I mean, it was Khrushchev himself who allowed Solzhenitsyn to publish his book. But it did not completely go away. It was a useful sort of place to put prisoners and get work done.
It's crazy to think that it's almost 1960 and that's still a thing.
Well, I want to go back. After World War II, of course, you see all of these different countries coming under the Soviet sphere. They're all trained, for the most part, by the KGB to set up their own secret police. Now remember, these guys are only spying domestically. They're only spying on their own countrymen. There were divisions in these secret police that spied on the exterior, spied overseas, and they're using some of the same techniques on both their own people and their enemies. So if I could have, let's see now, slide number 4, please.
I'm actually very pissed off right now.
Yeah. Well, we're going to get into a word salad. Poland had its Ministry of Public Security, or the UB, and then later the SB. These guys had a huge number of paid and voluntary collaborators. All of the countries had them. These were people who turned in their neighbors because they wanted their apartment. These were people who were settling a score. Or these were people who were accused of crimes because the local SB agents needed to fulfill a quota. And this is going to work into a horrible problem later on. The UB and the SB, if you go dig into some of the websites of the people who survived these tortures and everything, it's pretty horrific. You've got to be careful about the literature because some of it kind of goes too far. You can kind of tell that maybe the way they're wording this is maybe propaganda. But a lot of it is pretty believable. And these guys got the Ministry of Public Security, UB and SB, got really good at torturing people, not just beating them. Torture was more to adjust people's heads than to harm their bodies. It was a way to get them to confess to crimes and to turn in other people. So this was an important goal for the torture. And the tortures were pretty, everything from rubber truncheons on the feet to exposure to cold, exposure to heat, standing at attention for hours at a time, deep knee bends until you passed out, that sort of thing. So painful positions, lack of sleep. You would oftentimes find these guys, if you were starting to go asleep, you'd get a bucket of cold water on you and try to keep you awake. So people confess to crimes, generally speaking.
Now, these are people doing it to their own countrymen, right?
This is people doing it to their own countrymen. Yes.
It's insane to think that people would be capable of doing that.
For an ideology, to support the socialist ideology, people who did not follow the Marxist-Leninist, Stalinist position were considered wreckers and saboteurs and had to be found out. One of the good things about getting people to admit, to confess their crimes, was that the leadership could say, see, we told you, there are wreckers. We found them. So it was a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Outrageous.
If I could have slide number 5. Hungary was an interesting case. The AVH was a group they had a headquarters in 60 Andrassy Avenue in Budapest. That building is still there. It is a museum that outlines the terrors that happened in World War II under the fascists and the terrors that happened after World War II. And you can go it's pretty unbelievably intense tour. But that's where their headquarters were. And in fact, the dungeons down below, you can go tour through them and it'll break your heart. The Hungarians, though, had a special situation, and that was their uprising in 1956. When they tried to break away from the Soviet system, they broke into this building and drug the officers from the secret police out of the building. The next slide, if you're bothered by gore, I'm going to warn you, it's pretty bad.
Uh-oh.
So next slide, please, Dave. They drug the officers of the AVH out, hung them up from the trees by their ankles, and beat them to death as a way to get back at these guys. When the Soviets brought in the tanks and finally crushed this Hungarian rebellion, they never formed another secret police force in Hungary. It's an interesting thing. They just decided that it was far too, it wasn't worth it. And if I can have the next slide, please.
How do you not stay angry all the time?
I get really upset. This has been kind of unfun to study, but this is stuff you have to know and understand.
Yeah.
The DDR, the Deutsches Demokratische Republik, or the East Germany, as we call it, their Ministry for State Security, the Stasi, as they called themselves, the sword and shield of the party. These guys were interesting because they were into spying and espionage. I think mainly because they spoke the same language as the West Germans. There was a lot of infiltration, and they were afraid of that degree of infiltration that was happening. So they spent a lot of time observing people. If you want to find out kind of the flavor of it, there is a 2006 movie, I believe, called The Lives of Others. And it's the story of one of the spies. Now, these guys in the East Germany, they were trained by, of course, the KGB. Putin was one of the KGB trainers that worked in Dresden in East Germany. So he was here at that point during that. But East Germany, they had all sorts of interesting and very high-tech ways of spying on people. Microphones everywhere, peepholes everywhere, cameras everywhere. And when they would bring you into questioning, this is really a very strange thing that they found, is that they wanted somehow to keep your sweat so that they could find you with dogs later on, right? You sick the bloodhounds on you. And of course, the best way to do that was if you were sweaty for, your clothes, if you got a good smell. So when they would bring people into the headquarters for questioning, they would sit them down in a special chair, and they would have like a handkerchief, piece of cloth on the chair. And that's what you sat in as they questioned you for hours. And of course, you're nervous, flop sweat. And then when you left, they would keep the cloth in a jar so that if they ever had to find you again, they'd have the dogs sniff the cloth and go looking for you. They found thousands of these jars in
Who
storage.
thinks of it?
That's
Who
actually
thinks of
pretty
that kind of
ingenious.
thing?
I mean, it's just statistical as hell, but I mean, it's
sick.
data stuff, but it actually makes sense though.
It's very sick stuff.
Very sick.
Okay.
Like my
But
brain
it's
would never.
brilliantly sick, but
I could never conjure that up if I tried to.
yeah, I wouldn't. Yeah, who thinks of that kind of stuff? I don't even have the mindset to think that way, So I'd be shitty at that job.
Oh yeah, I can't imagine how you do this job. How you torture these people, coming up with more and more creative stuff.
I wonder if they hit you, though, that with getting ready to go into World War II, and he's clearing out close to 20 million people. I wonder if that played a large part into how just decimated Russia got in the initial aspects of the war.
That's something I've studied only a little bit, but the Hitler and Stalin had that secret pact, the Ribbentrop-Molotov pact. That pact says said they signed it in 1939 saying they would not attack each other. But there was a secret clause in that agreement that said, by the way, we're both going to attack Poland, and Stalin gets this much of Poland, and Hitler gets this much of Poland. So for a while, they were something of allies. And then, of course, Hitler turns the table on Stalin and comes up with Operation Barbarossa, where he invades Russia. But Stalin didn't want to fight, and Hitler didn't want to fight on two fronts, an Eastern Front and Western Front. He eventually got it, I think mainly because he needed the oil and because he hated the Bolsheviks. I mean, that ran deep in the German psyche. If I could have the next slide number 8. Thank you. Romania was a really interesting place. Of course, that was run after 1964, I believe it was, by Ceausescu and his wife. And that really was a very ugly sort of totalitarian system. And the special police, the Securitate, great logo. I mean, if I was a biker gang, that is a great logo.
I think you could pass for a biker gang. Don't you think? Don't you think, Steve?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, easily.
Should be a killer.
Get that leather jacket, get the colors on.
But the main thing, the Securitate spied on their own people and spied on visitors. If you were a visitor to Romania, actually to most of these countries, you had to turn in all of your foreign money and get their script, their money, and pay for everything that way. But people who visited Romania said that they would oftentimes look out their hotel window and see fist fights going on underneath their windows. And they finally asked around. Those were people who wanted to get paid to spy on the foreigner. And so they'd get to under the window and it's, I'm spying on this guy. No, I'm spying on this guy. And they'd get into fights because that was a way of making money, turning in information. Information was their currency.
Why would anybody want to go there? Like, I mean, who says I'm going to go to Poland during that time as a vacation?
Yeah. Oh, Romania was the worst. Ceausescu had this brilliant idea. He was going to balance the budget. He was Mr. Austerity. And so for a while, he would actually sell all the coal. Romania has huge coal mines. He would literally mine the coal, put it on cars, train cars, seal up the train cars, drive them to the Black Sea, unload the train cars, and the people never got coal. So they went for winter day after winter day after winter day freezing because Ceausescu was selling all of the coal that could have warmed them, selling it for hard currency and getting out of debt. Weird.
Crazy.
But and I know I'm just kind of doing a slideshow here, and I'll welcome your questions, but I want to get one more group in here, and that's Czechoslovakia. They had the STB, or the Statny Bezpečnost. They were a pretty creepy gang. They started before Czechoslovakia became a communist party, the communist government in February of 1948. Their state security started a little bit before then because they were dealing with the Nazis and trying to get them out. The STB in the early 1950s would have their own show trials. They got a group of 14 people, including this poor man in the picture. His name is Rudolf Slansky. He was a very high party official, and they tortured him and forced him to confess to crimes. And I think at least 10 of the people who were tried with him, including Slonsky, were executed. And the story goes, they were executed and they were cremated. According to one story, the STB agents who were taking the ashes to a particular location, it was cold, it was snowy, and the car got stuck. So they used Slonsky's ashes as sand to get the car unstuck.
Oh
Yeah,
man.
that's just as morbid.
And the rest of the ashes for everyone else, supposedly, they mixed in with the asphalt for a road project and used them to pave.
People
streets.
are, excuse my language, but people are fucked up beyond. I mean, that's just insane.
This is
And it was just like right before, like Czechoslovakia doesn't exist anymore, right? It's Slovakia,
it's the
right?
Czech Republic and
It's Czech
Slovakia.
Republic, yeah. So this was like way before that, because I mean, when did Czechoslovakia stop being a country? Something in the 1990s, right?
Uh,
It was.
I was there actually. It was New Year's Eve of 1992
There you go.
that they broke up, that they became two separate states.
Yeah, see all the stuff you memorize in geography of that whole area when I went to high school. They're like, no,
Sorry.
it doesn't apply any longer. No longer applicable. Yugoslavia, yeah.
Yeah, but Yugoslavia was a completely separate sort of case. But one of the things that the Czechoslovak STB guys were good at was compromat, getting pictures of people in compromising positions or faking pictures of people in compromising positions. Think the Steele dossier, think the P tapes that we're talking about now. That was a favorite technique of the STB. There was a pop star named Marta Kubishova, I believe her name was. She was hugely popular in the late 60s. She was even a member of a pop singing group called the Golden Kids. And she ran afoul of somebody in the government, and they were sure they faked pictures or they really were pictures spying on her having sex with a person, and they used those to end her career. So they did all kinds of stuff like that.
Do you think that the Steele dossier is a real thing?
I don't know.
Just curious.
I don't know. I'm going to wait until I hear more facts about it.
It's probably smart.
What I would like to say is, yes, this was a technique. Certainly was nothing beyond what these guys could do or how they trained to do it.
Now, Putin was trained in the KGB.
KGB, yeah.
Yeah.
KGB and served in Eastern Germany for several years. That's why he can speak. His German is quite good. That's why he and the German chancellor don't get along at all.
I don't think anybody gets along with Putin. He seems to be on an island to himself.
Yeah.
Well, Trump gets along with him just lovely.
Well, I'm not sure.
There's reasons there, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Putin's got
something. Putin really likes Stalin. Putin is trying to rehabilitate Stalin. So that should, tell you a little bit about what's going on. Are they doing all of these techniques? I don't know. We are seeing journalists and other people killed. We are seeing plenty of people being thrown into prison, like Pussy Riot and that sort of thing. So, there's still stuff going on. There is no KGB in Russia now. It's called the FSB, and it's kind of a different sort of situation.
There's a big to do about a couple of reporters, like one getting poisoned and then one getting I believe he was shot outside of the Kremlin fairly recently.
Yeah,
and they tried to pin it on Putin and his ilk.
Well, people getting poisoned outside of the Soviet Union, that was not unusual. It was usually spies that got that treatment with polonium.
Yeah.
One time it was poison in the tip of a umbrella.
Yeah, I remember that.
Some guy got jabbed.
Yeah, it doesn't take much either. It's surprising how little will kill you.
They had absolutely no mercy whatsoever for spies. There was one situation in Great Britain in the early 1950s that some Soviet ships were in the harbor, one of the harbors in Britain, and the British had sent out a frogman to go check underneath, spy stuff. And they didn't find him for 2 weeks. And when they did find him, he was missing his head and his hands. So
that was ruled accidental death, right?
Yeah, real accidental death. Yeah, missing his head. Yeah, and it was a really cruel time.
So glad I'm just a guy in 2018 in a small town in North Carolina.
Yeah, we would have made terrible spies. I'm sure.
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to make it.
Yeah.
Nope. And I would sing like a canary probably if I got somebody approached me with
any of these. No question. I mean, I'm glad I don't have to. I'm not in that time. I'm not in those situations. And most people did not deal with any of this. A lot of this was aimed at dissenters. But at the same time, a lot of these organizations at time had quotas. And they just picked up people off the street and tortured them until they confessed to a crime.
Guilt or innocence didn't matter. It was all optics.
Now, this becomes a huge problem in 1989 when the Berlin Wall falls. And the people who were victims of the KGB and all these groups, they wanted blood, right? So the governments, the brand new governments, were coming up with ideas called things like lustration, where they would say, okay, we're going to find these people. We're going to go through all of these files and find the informants, people who informed on other people. And we're going to find the agents. The agents, the KGB, the STB, the AVH, all of these guys, when they saw the writing on the wall and the government was dissolving, they had access to their own files. They went into their files, pulled them out, and burned them so that they had pristine records. They were not identifiable on paperwork as KGB or as STB or as HVH or any of these groups. They were completely unidentifiable. But the people who had been rounded up, the collaborators, the people who had been informed on, their files were still there. So they, in fact, bore the brunt of this. Some of the countries like Czechoslovakia said, look, we're not going to do this. The Truth and Reconciliation process that happened in South Africa, part of that happened in Europe as well, in these countries. So a lot of these agents, a lot of these guys who did the torture got off scot-free.
Of course.
Never caught.
So there's no Nuremberg or there's no chasing them down like they did with the Nazi?
Nope. Nope. Very, very little of that because the files were so corrupt. They would just, agents would go through the phone book and pull out names and say, I recruited this guy and this guy and this guy to be an informant. So now these people were informants and they had absolutely nothing to do with informing. Now,
hard to imagine something like this happening nowadays. And it was only 50 years ago?
Yeah. There are still people alive who went through this? Plenty.
And I still think things like this do happen, and I think they're going to continue to happen. I mean, the old adage of you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat it. I think things like this is going to continue to happen time and time again, unfortunately. I don't see an end to it. And whenever you have dictators that exist, and there's sure shit a lot of dictators out there, you're going to have some type of secret police, are you not? I mean,
yeah.
Granted, correct me if I'm wrong, the executive order prevents the CIA from spying domestically, right? They can't
Correct.
collect information
Correct.
internally, legally. Do you think that's do you think that's because they don't want our country or America to turn into a fascist type state of some reason? You think that was why the executive order was implemented? I think that was in the 80s.
Yeah, this is well, the CIA did a lot of interesting stuff all the way along the Cold War, all in the name of ideology.
They did some pretty shady shit.
Yeah, they did some pretty shady shit. I'm not going to say we were clean as the driven snow. We were in on this too, but we didn't do this, generally speaking, to our own people. The FBI did have covert spying. Remember, they spied on Martin Luther King Jr. They had all sorts of things happening there, but not wholesale. This is why with the Patriot Act and everything that's happened after 9/11 and tapping the phones, could you imagine what Stalin would have done with the internet?
Oh man,
that would have been a heaven-sent dream of these guys, to be able to listen and see our Twitter, see our Facebook. I mean, there's
a scary thought.
There's one Eastern European historian who basically says what we used to torture people, the information we used to have to torture people to get, we now just turn to their Facebook page and get all. And
it's more reliable too.
Yeah, much more reliable. So, it's can I give you an example? And this happened to Jerry and I, my husband and I, about informants. We really did have something to do with the STB. A few years ago, back in about 2006, we did a documentary on a medieval priest by the name of Jan Hus, who was burned at the stake by the Catholic Church in 1415 CE. Okay, so, and it set off a whole revolution. That's a whole nother story. But we were working on a documentary on this guy. And it turns out, as we started working, this was when Pope John Paul II was still Pope, still alive. And there was a huge meeting of historians who reviewed the process and came to the conclusion that the Catholic Church was wrong in burning Jan Hus at the stake. And this was a big convocation, and John Paul II issued an official apology for burning this guy at the stake in 1415, right? Interesting story. So this is all part of the documentary we were making. And we had contacted historians in Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic, a medievalist, really a fantastic historian by the name of Schmahel, František Schmahel. And he's the head of the medieval studies at the Charles University. And the Bishop of Prague, Cardinal Vlk, VLK. And we talked to them about this whole process, this forgiveness process in the Roman Catholic Church. And they said there was one Czech who had worked all this time to make this whole convocation possible, to make this apology possible. And his name was Holacek. And he had worked for years. He was a monk. He had worked in the Vatican. He had worked with the cardinal, this and that and the other thing. And he pushed this apology through. And he was given one of the top civilian honors in the Czech Republic that they could give him. It's called the Order of the White Lion. It wasn't the Order of the White Lion. It was the Jan Patočka Medal. Jan Patočka was a philosopher, I believe, who was tortured to death by the STB in 1977. And they had a medal and an award. And they gave it to this monk, Holacek. And Cardinal Vlk and Dr. Schmahel said we needed to interview this guy. And so we did. We chased him down. And we did an interview with him, and he talked about the process. And then as we are editing, almost done editing the documentary, I found was reading the Prague newspaper and found that Brother Holacek, they had taken the award away from him because they found out he was the STB informant in the Vatican.
Whoa.
Yeah, the guy we interviewed was a
What?
spy.
That's crazy.
He informed on people. He probably had informed on Cardinal Volk. Cardinal Volk during the communist period, he was still a priest. He was informed on, and they would not let him be a priest. He was a window washer. He spent many, many years as a window washer. Dr. Schmahel had run afoul of the government. He spent many, many years as a tram driver, as a bus driver. And so these men had been damaged by people like Holacek. And so we contacted them, and they said, you need to tell the truth. So we left Dr. Holacek, his interview, in the documentary, but then we put an addendum at the end and explained the story that I just explained to you.
Did they try to talk to you since you had talked to him?
Yeah, he hasn't contacted us. He's kind of disappeared.
Okay.
But I have to look at Cardinal Volk and Dr. Schmahel as men who respected the truth more than they wanted revenge. Fascinating individuals. But that's the kind of stories that you get from this period. They're not clean. They're not simple.
There's so much to wrap your head around, I think, with, because like I said, it's only 50 years ago that that kind of thing, like at its height, was going on.
Yeah.
It's like literally like right before I was born, it ended. It's hard to imagine the world being such a completely different place than.
See, I'm talking about like the 1950s, not the 1900s.
No, 1950s, 1960s.
Yeah, I was born in 70, so I didn't miss the 60s by much.
Steve.
There were, even in the 1970s, if you were arrested by the STB and not spending time in prison, you were sent to the uranium mines.
Oh, great.
Yeah. Yeah. That was their punishment. That was like their gulag.
Yeah, that's a death sentence.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's pretty crappy business. So when I think about this, and I think about what people did for ideology, making other people suffer for your ideology, it's pretty nauseating. It's the reason why people were so down about communism in the United States, because they could point at this stuff and say, this is what they do to their people. At the same time, the Soviet Union is pointing, this is 1962, 63, pointing at the civil rights movement, pointing at the marchers, pointing at the fire hoses and dogs being sicked upon the black marchers. And the Soviet Union saying, this is what you guys do. What about this? So it was an interesting time.
That's a good point, though.
Yeah.
That's a very good point. Wow.
So when people start throwing out this nonsense about America is a police state because I can only drive 55 miles an hour, or, when the libertarians say, taxes are slavery. No.
Oh, but Alex Jones says that it's true, Dr. Griffith, and what Alex Jones says, I mean, he's the cutting edge of truth.
Yeah. Right.
Okay, I'm glad we agree.
Yeah, just ask a sovereign citizen; they'll tell you.
Yeah.
How bad it is here. And it is. I've been overseas. I've been in many different countries all over the place, and I've seen some great countries. I've seen some ones that there's no way in hell I'd ever live there, and I don't think people that don't travel have any kind of gauge the way which they could, or metric by which they can gauge the difference between what living in America is like compared to other countries. And America may not be perfect, but I tell you, go to some of these countries in Africa, go to some of these, South Korea was beautiful, but I did not want to go to North, right?
Yeah.
But they're not big fans of North Koreans there. And so I hate when people just sit there and say how bad they think America is, when there's so many worse countries out there and so many horrific atrocities that could be committed that, yeah, like you said, our hands are not clean, but it's nothing compared to just the lack of liberties people have overseas in some other countries. You don't have freedom of speech. You talk in the wrong place at the wrong time, you go to jail.
I think we're good. We're to a good point now, but I mean, Dr. Griffith brought up a good point. You think back, I mean, what some of the other countries probably thought of us during the slave period or the civil rights period. I mean, we've done our fair share of atrocities as well. It's just crazy to think that they could point to us in the 1960s saying that, look what they're doing, when they have this kind of stuff that's going on, like on an everyday occurrence, like it's nothing. 20 million people.
Remember, the Soviet Union was trying to get African nations as sponsor nations. They were trying to sponsor African nations, trying to encourage them to come under the Soviet mold. So by pointing at our civil rights problems, they're saying, you want to be like the Americans? This is what the Americans are like. In 1968, the Soviet Union and their satellite nations came within inches of boycotting the 1968 Summer Olympics because the Olympic Committee had invited South Africa, which was still an apartheid state. So yeah, the Soviet Union talked a big game when it came to human rights. And of course, in 1975, many of the countries got together and signed the Helsinki Accords, which was a guarantee of human rights throughout the world. The Soviet Union was a signatory. All of their Warsaw Pact nations were signatories. The United States, I don't believe, was.
Crazy.
Yeah. That is yeah. Anyway, Cold War was an interesting time, really.
Dark time.
Do you think we're in still a type of Cold War in some regards? I mean, obviously not to that extreme, but I mean, do you think that we are still in competition with?
We're in the Orange War, Steve. We're in the Orange War.
Well, no, the Orange Revolution is Ukraine.
I meant for Trump's complexion.
Oh yeah.
Because he's a dehydrated
Cheeto.
Well, the armies are still there. The nuclear weapons are still there. We've still got submarines patrolling underneath the water. We've still got satellites spying on each other. Some people are kind of convinced that the Cold War is back.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not against calling what we're in right now a type of Cold War in some regards.
Neo-Cold War.
Neo-Cold War. And the worst part is this time, though, this is what's scary. We don't even know who's in charge of a lot of these nuclear weapons. We don't even know where they're at. There are so many misplaced nuclear weapons and things. We have no idea where some of these arsenals have went. And that's disconcerting to say the least, because at least before we had, some understanding where we think they had stockpiled, but now the accountability went to shit after the Russians broke apart and that fell.
By the way, Dr. Griffith, we just had a message in the chat from one of our loyal patrons and really good friends of the show, Jamie. He says that Dr. Griffith is my new favorite guest.
Why wasn't she your old favorite guest? She was ours.
Well, definitely. These are interesting. These are really important questions to look at now. To go deeper than, we've got these forces against each other. Look at the ideology. Look at what they're trying to do. our modern ideologies are not as cut and dried as they were. The Cold War was pretty obvious. The division was stark. The divisions are not so stark anymore. And we've come to some new conclusions about capitalism, socialism, economics, globalism, that we weren't prepared to handle. Globalism was supposed to end, the end of the Cold War and the end of communism, and we were all going to be global, and this was all going to be, everyone's going to be competing. That's kind of been short-circuited, I would say, by this new rise of authoritarian market systems. And I think these are important to look at. China, Russia. These are authoritarian systems, not so much totalitarian. They're not total control of the country, but an authority figure on top that makes all the rules. But we thought for many, many years during the Cold War, you had to have democracy in order to have capitalism. And we're finding out that, hey, capitalism works just fine under an authoritarian system. No more NIMBY, not in my backyard. You don't have that. You want a dam? You build a dam. You want, to have these things cleared out of the way? You clear those things out of the way. Thomas Friedman, the economist, even said, well, he's a kind of economist, even said, oh, to be China for a day and to fix all of these problems. So we're up against challenges that we're not prepared to really look at. And when we're going off half-cocked and tariffs are their tariffs, tariff wars are easy to win when you go off on that. That's not right. That's not being careful.
Agreed. Absolutely.
Any questions from the
Oh,
commentary?
I'm sure we do. Are you ready to open it up to
Sure, yeah.
questions? Okay. All right, guys. If you have any questions, drop them into the live chat. Steve, is there anything from earlier you need to go back through and?
No, not yet, but I am watching it. So if you want to ask Dr. Griffith some questions now, go ahead and put them in the live chat and I will get them from there, or super chat. I'm
I have
also
a question.
reading those, but
Sure.
I have a question. You talked a lot about the, the most fearsome ranks of the secret police, but I noticed that one was left off of your list, and I'm still trying to figure out what happened with these two, Boris and Natasha. Now, I believe that these were dastardly.
They were remembered for external use. That was the huge problem that the non-Soviet countries had. They had open borders. You could get Boris and Natasha to go up against Moose and Squirrel.
True story. I had a living girlfriend who named her breasts Boris and Natasha. So whenever I hear those names, I just have to and Boris was a larger one. That's all I remember. It's yeah. So I can't listen to Boris and Natasha without just losing it.
TMI.
Threw that out there.
Let's see. Convert Me says, what was Putin doing in the DDR?
Probably training. I actually, on a Twitter feed from the East German Museum, I can't remember their name, look them up on Twitter. They published just this week a group photo of Stasi and KGB agents posing for a photo. And I'm saying, secret police posing for a photo? And Putin's in it. People have been, it's been doing the Where's Waldo. And I think we found him. I'm not going to say absolutely for sure, but it's pretty strange. They were actually, at times they were really positive. Actually, Dave, if you haven't fallen asleep, I'm sorry, Dave, I don't mean that. Can you give me slide number 3?
And real quick, while he's doing that, I don't remember. You don't have a YouTube channel yet, do you?
Not yet. We're working on that.
Okay, because somebody had asked, but I was pretty sure that you hadn't yet established that yet.
We've been on vacation and we're moving. We're signing the papers on Wednesday. So it's like we're moving house. So I put everything on the back burner. Yeah.
You know what? I couldn't pronounce any of those if my life literally depended on it. If I was being tortured, I could not pronounce any of them.
NKVD, yeah. But this is a cartoon celebrating what these guys are doing. That's a KGB or NKVD officer, and he's strangling this three-headed serpent that's got imperialist running dogs. The rich guy and the saboteur and everything. That's a positive cartoon about the KGB.
Wow.
Them celebrating.
So more of a nicer, friendlier KGB.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Wow. All right, Steve, you got a super there.
We have a super chat. Yeah, here we go. From Squirreliosis, I believe that's how you pronounce it.
I have so many questions.
I'm curious on that too.
Is that Cyrus, the skeptic, you think? One of his?
No, this is new one to me. What do you think about those who say communism was more evil than fascism? Also, were we right to fight on the side of Soviet Union in World War II? So which is worse, communism or fascism?
That's a tough one. I am not in the camp that says a totalitarian system is a totalitarian system. Fascism had a lot to hate. The socialism that was under Stalin in the Soviet Union had a lot to hate. Frankly, it's not a contest. Neither one of them were systems that I would want to live under. The fascists were around for such a short period of time, but they were very much occupiers against the wills of the people. And I'm looking at this from the Czechoslovak point of view, because they were truly occupied, as were the Poles. And I have interviewed people who were under those systems, who, for instance, in occupied Czechoslovakia, or what they called it, the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, you had to get a license for your radio. That was a normal thing in Europe. That wasn't the unusual thing. You had to bring your radio in to the post office to buy your license. And the fascist overlords would put a big gold seal on the dial of your radio that said, anyone caught listening to non-Nazi radio stations will be shot.
I wouldn't even have a radio at that point. I'd be like,
Yeah. Actually, one of the gentlemen I interviewed, he was a little 7-year-old boy. His father was off fighting against the Nazis, and they had no idea where he was. And his mother was taken to a labor camp, a Nazi labor camp. And here's a 7-year-old kid was taken in by a farmer, and he hid up in the barn for 3 years, no education, getting fed by the farmer, and all he had was the radio. I mean, that was it. And it was an illegal radio, so he had to keep it really quiet and have it underneath the hay. So he was like 3 years behind everybody in school because he was hidden. His family was Jewish. In fact, his grandfather, who was his absolute favorite person growing up, he was a little kid, and he didn't know his grandfather was Jewish at all. Didn't know his family was Jewish. But this kid was crazy about the radio and crazy about the Lone Ranger and crazy about, there was a series of Westerns that came out of Germany before the war. And so he was big into cowboys and Indians. And he said that one morning his grandfather came down, was wearing his coat, and he had a big yellow star, the Star of David, sewn onto his coat, and he had his suitcase. And this little boy said he thought for a while his grandfather was made sheriff. And
Wow.
and that was the day his grandfather went to the train, and he never saw him again. When you get stories like that, when you hear these personal stories, fighting about which is worse, fascism or communism,
It seems
let's-
meaningless because they're both
yeah,
atrocities are
both
atrocities. Yeah.
atrocities are atrocities. That's a great way of putting it.
We actually had it wasn't a super chat, but it was from Streamlabs, but people can actually donate through Streamlabs. And one of our chat moderators, Gage, he said, love this guest, awesome host, and amazing supporters in the chat, and we appreciate it. And we thank our chat mods, by the way. You guys do wonderful jobs keeping the
But
chat.
which awesome host was he referring to?
Please.
You're right.
Let me get a coin.
How could it be?
You know what? We can keep her as a third host for a while. I don't mind.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, we can do that every so often.
I agree. I have one that we missed from the other day from the Reds rhetoric debate. And we forgot to do this, but I told him that I would make that up and read it. It says, if the earth is round, why are there still monkeys? As long as this brings some joy back to Steve and Kyle, I'll be happy. So thank you, Bombay, for.
Have you got time for one more story? I know I titled this.
No, absolutely not.
The Secret Police, and I promised pretty salacious stuff, and I want to tell one more story. This comes from an oral history I did of a man he was a young man in Czechoslovakia after 1948. He's living here in America. He sells crystal chandeliers. And he had a grandfather who, before the war, was a watchmaker. Watch repair, could do magnificent, delicate work with his hands and loved doing it. And he had a little tiny shop in one of the big towns. And when the communists took control, the grandfather was labeled bourgeois. He was labeled, he can't do watchmaking anymore because he had a shop. And so he was given the job as a night watchman in a lumber yard. But as many people did in Czechoslovakia and in other places, they had a gray economy, meaning that it wasn't a black market economy. It was gray market, meaning that they would do odd jobs for each other and not necessarily earn money. It was more of a barter system. And so if you had a skill like watchmaking, people would come to you and, barter a dozen eggs for you to fix a watch or something like that. The government really hated that, especially because if you were a good auto mechanic and maybe you didn't have enough tools, maybe you were tempted to take tools home from the factory, right? And you use that in the gray economy. So you're stealing from the factory and this and that. So the government really frowned on that. And the gentleman I interviewed said one night his grandfather came home and he had his hand all wrapped up in a handkerchief. It was bloody. And they asked the grandfather what happened. And the grandfather had said, well, the STB came and they had found out that I was still repairing watches. And they cut my fingers off. They took his hand to a chop saw and sawed his fingers off. And he opened up the handkerchief, and his fingers were in there. and they got him to a hospital, but it was too late to sew them back on. So
Oh,
yeah, that's the
people
kind
are fucked up.
that's the kind of shit they did. That was considered how you took care of the problem. And that was the kind of terror that they inspired in people.
I don't think I want to
Like I
hear the
said,
last story.
Yeah.
I don't
But,
see how
it's good that we
I don't
do
see
hear
how
those
you-
kind of things, though, so people don't repeat them. I mean, people should be outraged when they hear these kind of things.
there's still, though, like you said, people exist today that it's probably going on now.
Mhm.
I mean,
Yeah,
it's
we don't know.
bizarre.
We don't know. I mean,
Steve, you
there's
got-
stuff happening in Venezuela. We certainly had stuff like that happening in places like Uganda. I have a brother-in-law who lives in Uganda, and there's very little wildlife where he lives. And this is a place that should be teeming with wildlife, giraffes and all that. And it's just not, because under Idi Amin, they had to eat bushmeat, and they had to eat a lot of these animals. And it's only lately that countries like Costa Rica, have you ever been to Costa Rica?
Mm-mm.
It is
I don't.
one of those little Central American countries that are full of jungles, and they've got sloths, and you can go down and see sloths. in the
Oh, cool.
wild,
Those are the cutest things on the planet.
and capuchin monkeys and all that. And they realized, number one, armies were too expensive. They do not have a standing army in Costa Rica. And number two, that the natural habitat will bring in money. And so they have spent a huge amount of time and effort encouraging people to appreciate the wildlife. And Costa Rica is the most fun you can go to, as far as beautiful country, and you just go out into these national forests.
As long as you don't end up in Nicaragua, you're okay, right?
I feel
Yeah,
like a
as
sloth
long as you
would-
stay in
Yeah, I mean,
Costa Rica.
stay well south of Nicaragua.
a sloth would be
Yeah.
my spirit animal. I think
Yeah.
that would be that would.
Definitely mine. Yeah, I wear a sloth. Yeah.
So we got one more question that just came through.
Yep, we have one more
Yeah.
super chat here. Jammy asks, question: any truth to the Russians providing secret police to the PLO to help them keep in power?
Ooh. That one's a tough one. That
Well, it's Jammy.
Yeah,
of
that's
course. Jammy's not going to ask bad questions, I don't think. Just like it's in his nature.
and I'm not going to go out on a limb and answer that one. I mean, honest, I
It's plausible.
I don't have enough information on that. I mean, I just got my mind blown. I was reading a book on the Cold War, and reading about how South Africa in the early 70s had tried to start up a nuclear program. Right? South Africa?
Mm-hmm.
Who are they going to bomb? Each other? And we had gotten them to promise to stop it, to stop their nuclear program. But a year after they promised to stop it, there was a mysterious underwater explosion that was recorded on one of our satellites that we thought was a nuclear weapon. But we told everybody that no, it was just kind of some weird anomaly on a meteor hit the satellite.
That's weird to me because okay, they only had, from as I remember, like half a dozen of a stockpile. They didn't have very many, but when you detonate something of a nuclear arsenal, even underground, the way it produces a very specific S&P wave. So we know when a nuclear bomb has been activated. There is a very distinguishable fingerprint type that's not the same as a meteor impact. So is that just putting out misinformation, or why did it? Why was they trying to say that it was a nuclear weapon? We would know if it was a nuclear weapon.
It was Nibiru.
We understand seismic activity well enough to know when
Yeah.
even a small yield, even if it was a 20 kiloton, we would know.
But here's the
Nibiru.
problem. We found that Israel had been helping South Africa develop their nuclear program.
Yeah, they
remember-
developed a bunch of bombs. I mean, it got dismantled.
Well, no, Remember, Israel says they do not have a nuclear program. That's
Yeah. Okay.
Right. Wink.
But if they don't have a nuclear program and they find someone, South Africa, who's willing to experiment for them, I didn't know this happened. And this is like really recent information that's been declassified. I'm just like, hello.
There's probably
I had no idea.
PLO in
Goes
Russia,
on, but-
absolutely
Hmm.
not beyond the scope of imagination. In the Six-Day War in 1967, Egypt versus Israel, all of the Egyptian hardware was Soviet made. And all of the weapons the good ones were made in Czechoslovakia. And of course, the Americans backed the Israelis, and the Israelis just ran right over the Egyptians and the hardware. And so it was a very big embarrassment for the Soviet Union.
Okay. One last one last question.
Yeah. It's all these crazy combinations of groups.
It's definitely plausible, though. I mean,
Yeah.
as far as the PLO.
But it's a great question.
Oh wow! The best.
I gotta
the
ask,
best
dude. I
question
gotta
is getting ready to come your way right now. So brace yourself.
Okay,
Sure.
ready? What does Dr. Misha think of flat Earth? Just joking. Only joking. What are her thoughts on voter suppression, soft and hard? How free and open should free and open elections be? Which is a great question, better than the flat Earth one.
Although I'm interested, could you please
Yeah, I
answer?
might as well answer it. I mean, what is your
the
opinion?
first half of that question.
If you want to laugh hysterically, you're more than welcome to. By the way, that would be a great...
Okay. Flat Earth is bunkum. I've traveled enough. I've been to Europe. I've been to South America. Well, Central America. I have been to Australia. If I believe the flat Earth map, when I flew to Australia, it would have been faster to have flown over the North Pole to get to that, that FE map. If you
the
go
Mercator
between
projection map, or
it's
the
faster
UN
to
map,
go from Los Angeles
But
to over the North Pole to Australia.
I was in the Navy.
No, I went over
If we would have
Hawaii.
gone by flat Earth navigation, I would have been lost at sea a long time ago.
But she's not using the Awake Souls and Limitless map that we were introduced to.
Yeah, that one was
The one
really,
that needed 6 poles to work, I think.
Right.
yeah, that was. If you ever go to Australia, look up in the night sky, and you will see a sky that you will not recognize. It's like, how?
I've been to Melbourne.
You know what I hate? I hate that at some
Yeah.
point during every show, even when we have the best of the best, the smartest of the brilliant minds here, it always somehow divulges back to flat
Never go
Earth.
away.
Oh, okay. Oh, the question about free and fair elections.
Mhm.
They had elections in the Soviet Union. They actually, at times, had a representative opposition, but mostly it was a single party election. I am really, really angry about voter suppression. I'm a little bit more angry at voter suppression than I am at people who have the right to vote and don't. Because, my vote doesn't count, your vote counts. This is a system to support. Even if you have to hold your nose to vote, you are part of the system. And once you have invested in that system, I think you're going to support it.
Great. You just instantly became Jamie's ultimate favorite guest now, because he's a big proponent of the same thing. So
yeah, good deal.
Excellent. Well, I think Steve, is that all you see?
I think that is that. That is it. Yes.
Well, Dr. Go ahead.
Kyle, I did promise you one thing, didn't I, on Twitter?
Oh, what did you promise me?
A dumpster fire? Because that's all I ever get on Twitter.
No dumpster fire.
Damn it.
And my students will tell you it's not one of my lectures until I put on the funny hat. I do wear funny hats when I lecture.
Oh, please. Yes. Okay, perfect. I asked for this. Probably 2 weeks ago. Thank you so much.
I bet that is comfortable as hell too.
It's
do you
hot as hell.
Oh, I'm
where
sure.
do you
Wait,
get one of
I
those?
can't wear this if it's above, freezing.
I'm
Above.
gonna look like an idiot here. Is it rabbit? What is it made out
It's
of?
rabbit.
Oh, it
yeah.
is rabbit. Okay. Oh, oof.
I can assure you, when I lived in Czechoslovakia, I ate a lot of these. I
Rabbit's
didn't make
good.
that.
Well, can you the next time, because obviously you're going to be, well,
Mhm.
I shouldn't say that. We hope that you'll be back with us. We hope that you will.
I would love to be back the 21st, which is
Yes,
the
that's
50th anniversary of
absolutely.
the Soviet-led invasion of Czechoslovakia.
And we're going to put that in right now. But will you will you bring your tradition onto the show and do the funny hats with us?
Yes.
You don't have to wear the
I
whole
have
show
to
because I'm
now,
sure
don't
that's
I?
excruciatingly hot after 4 minutes or so.
I
My
think that's cool.
house is not all that cool, and this is like cooking my brains. It's great when I have the flu, and your head's congested. It works lovely
Oh, it's gorgeous.
for that. Yeah.
Well, how much would one of those run in Soviet times?
I think I could pull one of those off.
I
That might work for you.
bought this for 600 koruni, $20.
Wow, that's actually a lot cheaper than I thought.
It's odd for me though, because like I have to have like I very rarely wear hats because my head for some reason is oddly shaped. It like bowls out. So if fitted hats like kind of arc up and it looks like I'm trying to what's the right word?
Oh, you should get a sailor hat. We got to find a sailor hat for you.
I could probably pull a sailor hat off. I think I could pull one of those things. Do the like the sides droop down?
Oh,
Yeah, you can do it. You can kind of. There's different ways you can actually wear the hat.
Hell yeah, I need one of those.
Yeah, it turns into a Mad Bomber hat.
Nice.
All right, we're getting one
but
with
it's
the logo right in the middle.
But this is like kind of a more formal sort
like it.
of
I'm
hat.
a fan.
But you can get them in mink. They look gorgeous in mink. I couldn't wear
Good
mink.
memory. Well, thank you for that.
Anyway.
Well, Steve and I, we always say this when we have these type of talks, but for an hour and a half, in some of the shows that we do, it feels like 6 hours. But when we have episodes like this, they go by so quickly that it's unreal. So thank you for providing another very interesting talk for us. We appreciate you coming on and for getting in. I'm so glad we met on Twitter, of all places. Twitter is usually the last place that you meet anybody that you remain friends with.
Yeah,
Well,
Twitter
honestly,
ends friendships. Doesn't make it.
Yeah.
You guys are great. I love your program.
Thank you.
And it's a lot of fun. So
Thank
yeah,
you very
love
much.
to be on.
And Dr. Griffith and her husband will be starting their own channel soon. So you'll be able to enjoy stuff like this on a regular basis, more so than what you see here. Dr. Griffith's husband, Jerry, I believe is his name, correct?
Yes.
He will be with us on Monday at 8 p.m. Eastern, where we'll be talking about the King James Version of the Bible and how that came to be. So we want to thank her from the bottom of our hearts for stopping by. Guys, remember, on September the 5th at 8 p.m. Eastern, from Answers in Genesis and the Ark Encounter, Dr. Nathaniel Jensen will be with us that evening to have a debate with Dr. Herman Mays, and we'll be talking about some key points in his book, Replacing Darwin.
And we weren't kidding when we said it is one of the most brilliantly illustrated books I think I've ever seen.
Oh, it's beautiful. The way that the book is put together, I mean, it's just like, you really hate to open it up and crease the pages, but
yeah, I mean it's really immaculate. But
now for what the words say,
yeah, the informational context I'm having issues a little bit with, obviously. But I got to tell you, he's one of the nicest guys I think I've ever talked to, at least for one of the nicest creationists. I'm actually asking him like stuff from his book, and he's more than willing to answer. That's a rarity among creationists. So I'm just thrilled to death that he's going to be coming on, because there are some definitely questions in here. But,
and he's a Harvard graduate.
Yeah, Harvard biologist.
I'll just read his biography real quick so you'll know. Nathaniel Jensen earned his BS in molecular biology and bioinformatics from the University of Wisconsin-Parkside and his PhD in cell and developmental biology from Harvard University. His research findings have been presented at regional and national conferences and have been published in peer-reviewed journals such as Blood, Nature, and Cell. Since 2009, he has been actively researching the origin of species, both at the Institute for Creation Research and at Answers in Genesis. So that's going to be a really big debate.
Amazing.
September the 8th at 8 p.m. And just to remind you guys, I know a lot of you are asking about the antivirus talk. That's going to be Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern. He will be talking with a immunologist. I finally was able to say that correctly, Steve. The other day I tried to say it, and it took me like 8 times, and I hit it hard each time. I swear I trip over English more so than I do trying to pronounce foreign names. It's a bad thing. And then tomorrow we'll be back with Rick and Alexander the Great. So from all of us here at NonSequitur, it's good to be back, starting a new week with you guys. Stay tuned. We've got a crazy week coming up. Dinosaurs, viruses, none of them exist. Alexander the Great, King James, and drugs. So hell of a week.
Tune in for the drugs.
I like that for a sign off. Good night, America.
And watch because of the drugs.
Non sequitur. Your facts are uncoordinated.